to The Breach Show. I'm your host, Donya Ziaee, and as always, I'm excited to bring you our panel. Elle Jones in Halifax, Pam Pomater in Toronto, and Martin Lukács here in our Montreal studio. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, everyone.
We have a packed program for today, including how more Canadians are having trouble putting food on their plates, why some of them are becoming convinced that Bill Gates is personally to blame, and what we can do to hold the real culprits accountable. I'll be talking with economist Jim Stanford about runaway corporate profits, and our panel will discuss a new poll about bizarre conspiracy theories that have gone mainstream in Canadian politics. But first, we've got some celebrating to do. It's the 1-year anniversary of the launch of The Breach. Happy birthday!
Yay! Happy birthday!
Happy birthday!
Elle's got to sing, of course.
Martin, big congrats to you, especially. I know that as a managing editor and one of the founding members of The Breach, building independent media isn't an exactly easy thing to do.
No, that's true. But many hands make light work, and we have a small but amazing team who have been making this all possible, doing production and editing and social media and graphics, as well as a growing freelance network of contributors. Mm-hmm. And we also have a kind of growing base of monthly members who make this all possible. We don't have any sugar daddy or mommy billionaires. We don't have corporate investors. We don't have any corporate ads. We only have people who, give generously every month to make this possible.
Well, I want to get all three of you to talk about some of your favorite Breach moments, but first, to jog our memories, here's a little snapshot from 1 year of video journalism by The Breach.
Clear. Go ahead, open. Forward, copy all. Message to observer.
You cannot be prepared for helicopters dropping green men from the sky.
When things get especially sensitive, there's one sure way to tell. Trudeau breaks out the denim jacket.
A message of respect and reconciliation.
What we are saying is channel your energy and your anger where it needs to go.
And you are right to be angry that your life has become harder. I'm angry too.
Is he really angry? I don't actually feel it.
I'm angry too!
It's I'm angry too. He's trying to convince himself he's angry.
They can't control the message.
Elle, what are some of your favorite moments from 1 year of The Breach?
I guess a couple. One is, I think, some of the really good investigative work, particularly into policing. So the story on police foundations, the story on police's secret surveillance. So the ability to do left-wing investigative journalism, I think, is really valuable. And I think it's a good reminder that, this work of doing politics is also fun, and it also has humor and joy too. So, it's been nice just being part of trying to build something from the ground up with this show.
Yeah, that's been a really good reminder, and working with all of you, that doing this critical analysis doesn't have to be heavy and boring all the time. Pam, what about you? What are some of the highlights for you?
Well, I agree with Elle. I like the fact that we don't take ourselves too seriously. Like sometimes you see in mainstream media, people are so serious, the anchor is serious, the panelists are serious, they all fight angrily with one another, and then they go on to Twitter and fight against each other on Twitter, and it's just so serious. It's all about them. And I think in terms of the content, one of the things that turned out to be really useful was we did that little informative video, way at the beginning on Land Back, Martin. I don't know if you'll recall. And that's being used in classrooms, not just universities and colleges, but actually kids' classrooms. So when I go in and speak and they say, hey, I saw your video on Land Back and it helped me understand. That's what we want to do. We want to reach people, everybody where they're at. And I think, we're doing that.
What's in store for The Breach in year 2?
Well, hopefully more hard-hitting investigations, more videos like the land back one you mentioned, Pam, which was definitely one of my favorites that we put out there, and more analysis from you three as well. This has definitely been a huge pleasure and honor for me to get to spend some time with some of my intellectual heroes. So that has been fun. Also, the Gen Z members of our team have basically ground down the millennials among us. And so I understand that we're about to start making some TikTok videos as well. So look out for those.
Nice.
Let's just hope we don't embarrass ourselves on TikTok.
There'll be no dancing from me, that's for sure.
Well, happy 1-year anniversary again to The Breach. And we hope that all of you, our viewers, listeners, and readers, that you're going to stick with us for many, many more years to come. And we want to thank you for supporting us and helping us grow. Our sustaining members have been essential to everything we do. You know, as an independent media outlet, we rely on every dollar to make our journalism possible. So if you're not already a member, please consider contributing to our work. Go to breachmedia.ca. We'll be back with our panel in a bit, but I want to first bring in a special guest for our next segment. If you've been to a grocery store anytime in the last few months, chances are you've noticed that food prices are soaring. A new survey by Food Banks Canada found that as many as 1 in 4 Canadians are eating less because of rising prices. As many as 1 in 5 say they're likely to use a food bank. But at the same time, Canada's biggest grocery store retailers are reporting record profits. Last year, they made $7.3 billion in pre-tax profits, which is more than double what they made before the pandemic. And it's not just grocery stores that are making obscene profits in the midst of a crisis. Oil and gas, big banks, real estate, food and drink manufacturers, they've all been padding their bottom lines. Statistics Canada says that in the first quarter of this year, the after-tax corporate profits broke new records, even as inflation surged. To help us make sense of all of this, we've invited Jim Stanford, the director of the Center for Future Work and a longtime union researcher. He joins me from Vancouver today. Hi, Jim. Welcome to The Breach Show.
Donya, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's really great to have you. So Canadian corporations have been profiting enormously from the pandemic and now from inflation. Meanwhile, for lots of people in Canada, the standard of living has been actually declining. Prices are going up, wages are going down. How do you explain what's going on here?
You know, it's funny. People don't think of it this way, but who actually sets the prices for these things? You know, it isn't the workers in the grocery store who determine what the food is going to sell for. It's the grocery store. And same goes for the gas stations, and same goes for the housing developments and all the other things where the price has been rising sky high. So frankly, we shouldn't be too surprised that corporate profits have surged as inflation has taken off. Now, there's all kinds of things happening in the background, of course. As the world economy reopens after the pandemic, we've had lots of problems in the traditional supply chains. Things like semiconductors, for example, very hard to get. That drives up the price. Of course, the war in Ukraine and then the spike in global energy prices, that's translated directly and very quickly into things like the gasoline we buy in Canada. Even if that gasoline was refined from oil pumped from the ground in Canada months before Putin invaded Ukraine, you know, so there's no obvious connection, frankly, between Ukraine and the price of petrol, but that's how the global oil market has done it. And all the other prices that are going up, it's companies that are taking advantage of the moment of the, the stresses and uncertainty after the pandemic. That's what corporations were designed to do. They have the legal status of an individual in our law. They have powers and rights and protections. And their mandate, literally and legally, is to maximize the wealth of shareholders. And that means maximizing the flow of profits. In fact, you could argue that it's illegal for corporate directors to do anything other than try to maximize their profits. So, on the one hand, I don't want to let them off the hook in terms of morality. The billionaires who own grocery store chains like Loblaws are making a killing and off of the backs of poor people who can barely afford their groceries. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. This is how we've organized our economy, and that's what those companies are going to do unless and until we put other restrictions in place that force them to behave in a more fair and socially accountable way.
I really want to put some visuals to this, to the kinds of profits we're talking about, and I want to throw up on the screen a graph of that you produced actually, which shows that this year corporate profits have been the highest that they've been in more than 60 years, and they've had the highest share of total GDP that they've had in all of these years. And to talk about the kinds of solutions that are being offered to address this, I want to turn to Pierre Poilievre, the front runner in the conservative leadership race. He said that the reason people can't afford gas or groceries is, quote, a transfer of wealth from the have-nots to the have-yachts, which is admittedly pretty clever. And okay, so far so good. There's been this transfer of wealth. But then he goes on to blame the Bank of Canada for printing too much money and causing inflation. And when his critics accuse him of undermining trust in institutions like the central bank, he says people are just upset because he's, quote, rattling the elites. And I wanted to ask you, is he actually rattling the elite? Or what would it look like if the elite, the corporate elite in Canada, were actually rattled?
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Poilievre is no doubt a very clever communicator. His argument about what has caused the inflation, I think, is wrong. The Bank of Canada did not print money. The Bank of Canada did take extraordinary efforts during the initial period of the pandemic to stimulate credit creation and money supply at a moment when we thought we were all going into a deep, deep recession. In fact, we did go into the deepest recession since the 1930s. And in part, thanks to what the Bank of Canada did, and in part, thanks to what the federal government did with all of the income payments like the CERB and other income supports, we snapped out of that recession far quicker than most people thought. So, to some extent, the inflation that we're experiencing today is a side effect of the fact that our economic recovery from COVID has been faster than expected. But that's a good thing. That's the point. We could have avoided inflation if we'd have just stuck with a deep, long-lasting recession during the pandemic, and that obviously would be far, far worse. Mr. Poilievre is trying to tap into a kind of a sense of working class outrage or discomfort or anger about how the economy has unfolded in recent decades. And in this regard, he's similar to other right-wing populists around the world, like Donald Trump, who also tried to tap into deep working class anger about the disappearance of opportunity for working people. And there's certainly a reservoir of anger, and it's justified. Working people have seen their share of the economic pie shrink. They've seen, the hollowness of all of the promises about equal opportunity and so on. But Mr. Poilievre's direction is absolutely wrong and would make things much, much worse for working people than they already are. If we really want to help working people win back some of the wealth that has been redirected to elites, not because of the Bank of Canada printing money, but because of the power imbalance in our free market capitalist economy. That's the reason that the billionaires who own energy companies and grocery store chains are making out like bandits while the rest of us see a declining standard of living. And Mr. Poilievre's vision, to symbolically fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, that will do absolutely nothing to help workers. If we want to help workers, we could give grocery store workers a union that could win the $2 back, $2 an hour that was paid for a few short months during the pandemic. That should be a permanent thing, and other ways to put more money in the pockets of working people.
Yeah. Well, one of the other policy options that some are advocating is an excess profits tax. The UK has already temporarily instituted this for energy companies. The IMF has also jumped on board, saying that there should be a permanent excess profits tax on oil and gas firms. And here in Canada, the NDP has been proposing this tax for big box stores as well as oil and gas. Can you help us understand what this tax is and what it would do to address this kind of profiteering?
Well, the idea of an excess profits tax has actually already been implemented in Canada. Curiously enough, the federal government did it in their last budget. They imposed a retroactive and pretty significant excess profits tax on the banks. 15% of the profits they made during the 2021 year, when they were being obviously heavily supported by government and the Bank of Canada to get through the pandemic. And they made a fortune during the pandemic. So, quite reasonably, the federal government said, we're going to collect some of that. You'll still be making a fortune, and we'll put the proceeds towards the different programs that we had to pay for to try and protect people through the pandemic. The NDP under Mr. Singh has proposed a similar expansion of that tax to cover the oil and gas industry, who are making incredible profits right now, and possibly some other sectors where profits are higher than usual. It's it's absolutely legitimate. It would help the government redistribute some of the wealth that's being collected by corporations into better causes. We could have a good discussion about how do you measure what's an excess profit versus what is a regular profit. I think some of those details could be worked out. We could actually just look at increasing the general rate of corporate profit tax in Canada. It's been cut dramatically since the turn of the century. The federal corporate income tax rate has been cut from 28% to 15%. That's almost in half. Provincial corporate income tax rates in most cases have been cut as well. Both a kind of an immediate excess profits tax, but a longer term revisioning of how we collect taxes from companies would be part of the solution. But there's other things that have to be done too, in terms of empowering workers to win higher wages. That's one way to cut into cut into corporate profits. Yeah. Regulating companies that use a dominant market position to extract too much profit from either customers or their suppliers, and other measures. Those are ways to get profits back to a more legitimate share of overall income, and in so doing, take some of the steam out of inflation that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned strengthening workers' power, and I wanted to ask you, just as a final question, is organized labor, are unions in Canada where they need to be to help strengthen the standing of workers when we're dealing with record inflation? People are taking effective wage cuts, and the moment is ripe too for asking for major wage increases.
Oh, we're seeing a lot of anger and a lot of militance from workers in all kinds of industries across the country. Private sector industries like construction in Ontario, thousands on strike. Public sector workers who've been, squeezed by these absolutely authoritarian pay restrictions, like Doug Ford's 1% increase that he's allowed teachers and nurses and other public servants for 4 years in Ontario. So, workers know that their real standard of living is declining as inflation picks up, and they want some protection. So we are seeing a lot of labor militants in collective bargaining talks, and we're going to see a lot more over the next couple of years. The big challenge is, of course, that most workers don't have a union. So union representation in Canada is about 30% of the workforce. In the private sector, it's only about 15% of the workforce. So most workers don't have that kind of collective strength that comes with a union and a union contract. So for them, hopefully, this is a moment to think, I should get one of those unions. And we are seeing, obviously, some signs of an uptick in union organizing activity in all kinds of sectors in Canada. The Starbucks unionizing in America gets tons of headlines, but there's, in a way, much bigger union organizing efforts going on in Canada that don't get the same profile in sectors like long-term care, logistics and warehousing, transportation, manufacturing. So those types of efforts have to continue. If workers don't have the collective power of a union, then they just don't have a chance of trying to protect themselves, let alone win a share of future prosperity.
Well, we'll be watching and hoping for the kind of militancy you're talking about, Jim. Thanks
Me
so
too.
much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Donya. Good luck.
Great to talk to you. That was Jim Stanford, the director of the Centre for Future Work. He's in Vancouver. I want to turn back to our panel now, who've been listening to this conversation. Pam, what goes through your mind when you hear about these astronomical corporate profits in the middle of a pandemic and record high inflation?
Well, all of it makes me extremely concerned for First Nations, because we know throughout history, and it doesn't matter what government, political parties in power, we know that austerity measures are born first and foremost by First Nations in particular. It's happened every time we've had a recession, every time there's been some kind of difficult economic issue. First Nation programs are the ones to be cut first. I mean, don't forget the infamous 2% cap on social programs that was instituted decades ago that didn't account for inflation or population or actual costs. Now add to this, we still haven't even caught up to the unraveling of that 2% cap from decades ago. So I'm very concerned about the kinds of policy decisions that'll be made. And hopefully this time around, it won't be First Nations that bear the brunt.
Elle, where is the outrage when we talk about this kind of corporate power and the policies that, as Pam says, are sure to follow? I mean, we're talking about millions of people in Canada having to choose between food and rent. We're talking about workers effectively taking massive wage cuts because of inflation. And meanwhile, these corporations are, raking in record profits. Their CEOs are walking away with $1 million more in salaries than they used to. This is the kind of injustice that should be riling people up across the political spectrum. Where do you see outlets for this anger, if anywhere?
Well, I think it does rile people up. And in a sense, it's almost like the economy is trying to roll out a red carpet for Pierre Poilievre, for example, right? That we know that these are the conditions that often lead to these rightward swings. Because people have this false notion that when you actually look at the stats, conservatives are not more fiscally responsible, but there's always this idea that we save money and we come under budget as when we're with a conservative government. And that's a myth, of course, but it gets reinforced. And then, of course, without an effective left that's finding ways to talk about this, you end up ceding that ground to the right wing, who are very effective in coming in when people are suffering and proposing authoritarian means, this kind of faux populism that we see. So we should all be very concerned. And then, of course, it's not like, the left, however we want to talk about it, hasn't been talking about corporations forever. But we also have a very kind of liberal discourse that likes to see corporations as some kind of liberal progressive good, whether that's them donating to BLM or, that we want them to police Twitter through corporations. So I think even though we do have a superficial kind of way of talking about the corporate elite and the rich, we've also allowed corporations to so much embed themselves into normalcy, as though a corporation in itself isn't monstrous, as though it's not a complete sign of a deviant society, right? So even as we pretend to critique it, we don't really. And I don't think we really have a very good discourse on thinking about, how unnatural so much of what we experience is. How unnatural it is to have these inflated police budgets, how unnatural it is to have these billion-dollar transnational corporations. This has not been seen before in history. It is unprecedented. And so much of the social fracturing we experience is a result of that. But yeah, as the left, we have to get it together because we know what's going to happen. And we see it happening in the States. We see it happening everywhere across the globe. And it will happen in Canada too. We like to think we're immune from, some of these more distressing forces. And we're not. And we've seen that already in Canada. So if we don't find a way to combat this, we're going to be, Prime Minister Poilievre. And isn't that too many P's for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have mainstream conversations about corporate power in Canada, although arguably the pandemic and these kinds of profits that we're seeing are changing that a little bit. And right now, Martin, as I was discussing with Jim, the NDP has, for example, tried to bring this issue front and center. They've proposed an excess profits tax. And actually, I want to play a clip first of Jagmeet Singh making the case for this tax.
Here's the truth. Why is the cost of everything going up? Simple answer, greed. When the cost of things go up, it hurts some people, but it benefits those at the very top. And it's not the grocery store workers, those that stock the shelves, farmers that grow your food, or small businesses and grocery stores like this. Large corporations, big box stores, and big retail are making record profits in this time. Why should you pay more and more just so that large corporations can make more and more profit? It's a rigged system, set up that way by liberals and conservatives. That's why New Democrats are demanding that we tax the excess profits of large corporations and invest that back into people. Housing, healthcare, the climate crisis. We can tackle all these problems if we make the super rich start paying their fair share. We have to end the free ride for the super rich.
Now, Jagmeet has also said that the Liberals don't have the courage to go after corporate profits, and that he's willing to leverage that supply and confidence agreement that the NDP reached with the Liberals in order to get them to agree to this task. I mean, he's been really hammering this point lately. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm probably like one of the resident grumps when it comes to criticizing the NDP at the Breach Show, but I'm honestly like pleasantly surprised by Jagmeet Singh kind of going after the corporate elite on this point in a more consistent way than we've seen from them in a while. So credit where it's due. I think, I know it from a former close advisor of Jagmeet Singh's that he didn't even a few years ago like using the word elite or establishment. So he's clearly putting in a good effort, The problem is that, as it often is with the NDP, this can't just be like a flavor of the month thing that they do, that, their pollsters told them to do. I think that they need to make it stick. They really need to keep at it and, tell a broader story about the corporate stick-up that we're dealing with right now, and the kind of society we could build if we put our hands on the billions of profits that are sloshing around in corporate coffers or in offshore tax havens. And, I think at that point, if they did it regularly, consistently, mobilizing public attention even more so than they're doing now, then you'd start seeing, the corporate media start howling. And when that happens, then it's making an impact.
Well, these questions around corporate power and gross inequality, as I mentioned, have been front and center since the pandemic started because of these astronomical profits we're seeing. But people are doing some pretty impressive mental gymnastics, too, to avoid actually calling it what it is. And in the last 2 years especially, we've seen a new constellation of really bizarre conspiracy theories in terms like replacement theory or the Great Replacement, the Great Reset. They've become household words. A new poll this week from Abacus Data showed that these ideas may be even more popular than many of us are willing to admit. Let's take a look at some of what they found. In this first graphic, you'll see on the top line, we've got 44% of the people in the poll saying that they believe that, quote, big events like wars, recessions, and the outcomes of elections are controlled by small groups of people working in secret against us. Some 41% on the second line think that, quote, much of our lives are being controlled by plots hatched in secret places. And then there's a disturbing 37% who think that, quote, there's a group of people in this country who are trying to replace native-born Canadians with immigrants who agree with their political views. This is also known as the Great Replacement theory, the new Nazi conspiracy theory that was also behind the recent mass killing in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Buffalo. I want to ask you, Pam, we're not just talking about just skepticism here, but there's these are outlandish theories that people actually believe in. And even if we find these theories twisted or dangerous, I mean, what do they tell you about where the public is at?
Well, I think there's several important things to understand. I mean, that data spoke to, those who have the greatest mistrust in government, interestingly enough, are people without post-secondary education, people from Alberta, and people who have really right-leaning politics. So those three things are have different commonalities to them. And we know from all of the psychological research that's been done here in Australia, the UK, and the United States, that there is a link between people who have lower or no education and those who have far right-leaning ideas and are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And in fact, what the research is suggesting is that if you want to combat things like far right extremism and domestic terrorism, for example, and you want to combat all of the misinformation that's associated with conspiracy theories, it's really about bolstering your society's inclusive quality education, not just K to 12, but beyond, whether it's college or university or some other skills training, so that people understand, how to think critically, have access to information, they know how to do their own research, all of those things, because the statistics really tell a tale about who is holding on to these views and who isn't.
Well, I have to say, though, for me, one of the things that was interesting about the poll was actually that when you look at the detailed breakdowns of the demographics of people who support these ideas, it's true, absolutely, the majority are Pierre Poilievre supporters, they're People's Party supporters, they're on the fringes, on the far right. But there's also something like 40%, for example, of NDP, Liberal, and Green Party supporters who believe that, small groups of people are working in secret against us. There's almost 30% in the NDP, Liberals, and Green Party supporters who believe in the replacement theories. That's not insignificant either. And Elle, I guess I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, these are elements that are also in our own backyard, no?
Well, first of all, let's name what is really the dog whistle in small groups of people. They mean Jews, right? So this is the old Jewish conspiracy, Jews of the New World Order stuff. And I think we need to separate the conspiracy element from the kernels of truth that rest within this. So if you say there are groups of people that plot our demise, you mean the elites that we just talked about? Like, you mean how corporate elites and politicians actually do share an agenda? And of course, that doesn't have to take place by sitting in a room smoking a cigar and like everybody shakes hands and agrees. It takes place because they have a shared interest, right? So you don't need to meet in a room in order to understand that elites in our communities as well share those interests. This is part of neoliberalism. It's a shared interest across media, across the professional managerial class, across corporate elites, across political elites, military elites, right? So that is true. And that obviously people have recognized on the left for generations. So we can't call that a conspiracy theory. In Halifax, we have an international security forum where people quite literally get together in the West and plot the path for war, right? But that is, I think, a different matter than what is implied in some of these theories, which is like the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, that, Jewish people also, of course, control Black people in particular, that we're under some controlling Jewish intelligence. The idea that this, takes place in this particular way, like that it's quite literally like, let's go screw over the working class today, But I think we have to understand that there are roots to this. So I think the way the questions are framed perhaps doesn't necessarily tease out what they're really trying to get to. In some way, I think the questions in these polls are perhaps badly framed because one can believe that, there are elites that have bad intentions for us without believing that that is Jewish people or something, right? So I think we need to also tease out what we're talking about here, because what makes the thing a conspiracy theory isn't the recognition of how power works in our life. It's this idea that it becomes this kind of grand overarching theory that replaces critical thought in all places in order to create one narrative. So, you get this idea that you can tie everything together through these conspiracies that, so rather than politically organizing, if we sit and do some like esoteric number math or something, then we can uncover some truth. Or, you have the QAnon stuff, right? So I think it's what direction that takes. Like, do we recognize that there are these elite forces and then organize against them, whether that's organizing against corporations, organizing against the government? Or do we believe that there's this kind of conspiracy beyond us that is, how do I put this in like plain, like this idea that it's almost like we can't do anything about it because it's a conspiracy. So it actually becomes a way of politically making us not want to organize. The idea that, neoliberalism, there's nothing outside of it and you can't win, so don't bother. So just stay on Twitter hashtagging things or, sit in your room talking about QAnon or whatever, right? So it's actually a way of us not organizing against power, because instead of being accurate at how power works, it just becomes all this kind of fishy stuff that you can put together in your mind and then ever add to in this ever expanding way that becomes crisis actors and becomes a revival of Holocaust denial, which you're seeing a lot of now. I don't trust any information at all, so therefore I don't apply a critical mind to anything because all information is bad. It's all of those formulations that lead people away from being able to think accurately and critically about our political system.
Just to pick up on some points that you two made, I think that if you look kind of like the history of conspiracy theories and when they tend to flourish, it's really interesting that often it kind of comes at a particular moment when grievances or skepticism about elites is strong, but also when the left is weak. Because I think that, like you were saying, Elle, when there isn't a sense that you often get in thriving movements of conceptual language and a kind of institutional understanding of how things work, often you go for those kind of shortcuts, a kind of socialism of the fools. You look for those oversimplified answers that, make everything seem connected, not random, make everything, seem like it doesn't happen by accident, it just happens entirely by design. And as you say, that's incredibly, ultimately disempowering. Because if the people we're up against are so competent and so intelligent that they can never be outmaneuvered, then we might as well not organize for change. And it's interesting, if you look at the social science, it's shown that the more people who believe in conspiracy theories, the more likely there are to not engage in politics. So there's a direct relationship. And I kind of remember back when the anti-war movement was really strong in 2002, 2003, people felt a sense of agency. They felt like they could maybe stop the war. And when the movement kind of collapsed, you saw kind of a year or two later, the growth of 911 truther movement, which was in many ways a kind of fed on the kind of carcass of hopelessness that people felt about stopping the U.S. empire. So I think that if people have a feeling of that agency, then I think they're much less drawn to conspiracy theories. This is more on the left, Mm-hmm. But I also think we've probably, all of us, had friends or family or comrades who have kind of succumbed to the latest wave of conspiracy theories. In many ways, the pandemic has kind of supercharged the appeal of them, certainly on the right. You know what I mean? I've certainly had friends who've kind of traveled the pipeline of, corporate critique to anti-vaxxer politics, and it's been pretty disturbing to see.
Yeah. And that was another interesting detail in these polls, which was that a strong majority of the people who believe in these conspiracy theories said that they didn't get vaccinated against COVID-19 and don't believe in vaccination. And again, you're all saying, there's often a kernel of truth to the frustrations that inform people's desire or willingness to believe in these theories. So with the pandemic too, it's a response to the failure of our governments to respond in a way that, as we saw with the interview with Jim Stanford, the very uneven kind of effects of this pandemic on our population. But again, it raises the question, why are people seeking answers and outlets for these legitimate frustrations in conspiracy theories rather than finding them elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to build off that too, reality has been pretty surreal on its own during the pandemic. I mean, when someone like Jeff Bezos makes $17 billion in a day, something is incredibly wrong and feels like it needs a simple answer, or even people's skepticism towards big pharma, so much of which is legitimate, or the COVID mandates, which in any other circumstances would seem like coercive political control, if not for the fact that they have a really important public health imperative. But when there isn't a strong left that can provide those kinds of fact-based answers for people drift towards simple answers and become especially susceptible to right-wing faux populists like Pierre Poilievre and others who are offering conspiracy-inflected answers to the problems that they face in their lives.
Yeah, so again with anti-vax, I mean, pharma critique is real, and we don't need to conspiracy about this because we know, for example, the opioid epidemic was fed by that one family that they call the Stettler family that, created OxyContin, lied about it, got doctors to lie about what it was, and this fed the addiction crisis. So we've always had a critique, again, on the left of the pharma industry that ties into things like privatized healthcare, the lack of Medicare in the United States. And so part of what happens, and this is Stuart Hall talks a lot about this, right? That when Marx believed that, we would just develop class consciousness as workers, talking to each other, of course, it doesn't always happen that way, right? So you can take a truth about the pharma industry is extremely powerful, is, preventing in this, especially in the United States, preventing things like universal health care. But instead of then being like, we need to fight for universal healthcare, becomes a conspiracy theory about vaccines having like tracking chips in them, right? So it's always this way, and often moving from critiques that we've made on the left for a long time that then get recharged and sent onto the right, removed from the political left-wing content, right? So now you take out the bit about how therefore we need free Medicare, and it just becomes the government is tracking you through your vaccine, right? So I think, it's tempting to sort of dismiss it as these people are idiots or something. But I think we actually really have to think about what are the social forces that drive people towards these narratives, and how do we, in that sense, intervene in it? Because if people can be sent that way, they can also be pulled back, right? There's really interesting sites like Families of QAnon Members. There's a Reddit where it's like literally just families of QAnon trying to intervene with their families, and the destruction is real, right? People talking about how their family has been torn apart by people that have really bought into these conspiracy theories, have detached from their families, detached often from their jobs, sometimes from their lives, and are causing great destruction. Like, this is actually not some minor intellectual thing. This is happening within families. And then people are really trying to intervene and de-radicalize their family members and trying to find ways to do it, So it's having a real social impact. It was obviously accelerated by COVID, where people were home, online, losing their jobs, in this anxiety, in this state of, and then recognizing truths around how this world works and how you get screwed over and how workers don't have any power and how you're getting poorer and poorer and how, yes, there is this class of people that's getting richer and richer. And we have to, again, as Pam said, there has to be popular education around this. There has to be education around thinking critically, and it can't just belong to this small class of intellectuals. We have to be giving that work to our communities and to people, and not just dismissing people when they're struggling with these things, because it is a process. People talk about, they enter this, and then you fall deeper and deeper, and there's a social, this people around it that, you get friendship, you get, when people feel very alienated from society, these become very tight bonds. And so, yeah, I think it's very tempting to sort of say that people are just being silly, but it's not. It's a real social force that speaks to the real alienation people feel, the real senses of despair, the real failure of so many systems for people. And people are looking for answers. And this offers people a way to make sense and to arrange things and to create order in a world that is disordered for them. And so we really need to, I think, be empathetic to it, but also find ways to intervene in it and understand how dangerous it is as well, for our organizing, and also, of course, for all of it. Because what it leads to is Trump and the storming of the Capitol, right? So it has real political danger as well.
And I think another really good example of this kind of people turning to conspiracy theories as a means of making sense of systemic failures is the popularity of the Great Reset theory as well, which again in this poll was notably high. I mean, there were like 20% of the people who said they believe it, but what was interesting was that there were almost 40% who said it could be true, don't know. So this Great Reset theory is a suggestion that corporate elites at the World Economic Forum have the secret agenda under their leader, Klaus Schwab, to restructure the whole world. Martin, can you just give us a quick overview of what the agenda of the World Economic Forum is and why it and Schwab have become such perfect villains?
I mean, he's a uber wealthy, uber corrupt, German accented tycoon. So it's like kind of a perfect villain. But this is another example of one of those conspiracy theories that have a kind of populist valence to them. And they start with a kernel of subversive truth to them, which is that the World Economic Forum is a band of global elites that meet on a yearly basis in Davos, at the top of a Swiss mountain, and, essentially party and connive. All of that is true. Where the right wing kind of goes into la-la land is they think that the agenda is secretive and it's an attempt by global liberals and globalists to impose an agenda of communism and forced vaccinations and a kind of socialist re-engineering of the world. And honestly, what the World Economic Forum does is far more boring than that. It's a really kind of hapless effort to rebrand capitalism, which is already the globally dominant and exploitative and unequal system. And it's been fascinating to me to watch the right just completely own this issue, and I think confuse a lot of people about it. And I think that in part it has been the decline of the strength of the former global justice movement, anti-globalization movement, which really, I think, for a while educated a lot of people about the, pernicious impacts of the global economic architecture through the World Bank and the WTO, and including the World Economic Forum. And I think we have to really, level up that analysis that I think used to be quite a bit more common than it is now, 20 years after the kind of height of the anti-globalization movement.
And Pam, you made an important point that I really don't want to get lost in all of this, which is that so much of what informs people's being drawn to these kinds of conspiracy theories are racist ideas and conceptions that exist not just on the right, but among centrists and even on the left as well. And I guess seeing these various politicians, including Polyev at the forefront of it all, capitalizing on all of this and having so much support. I mean, how worried are you to see these trends in Canada?
Very worried. Look at what happened in the US. Look at what happens around Canada when you have white supremacists, white nationalists, white incel groups, like whatever white hate group, pick any of them. And they're, shooting Native people, shooting women, running people over, making threats, plotting threats. I mean, we've got the biggest a group of them in Canada. Of all the countries in the world, we have the most amount of online hate groups, primarily white supremacists, who are both plotting violence against others, primarily Black and Indigenous women and other racial minorities, and also their own governments, because they too are perpetuating this idea that all white people are somehow being replaced by Indigenous peoples, Black peoples. I mean, this is really coming out of the whole old stock Canadian kind of language, where the real Canadians are the white guys who settled here and with a total disregard for Indigenous peoples, or the Black slaves that they brought over. And somehow they are the only legitimate immigrants to Indigenous territories, and that the new ones who are not white are somehow a threat to them, a threat to their businesses, a threat to their economic hold, political hold on the current power here. And we only need to look at the United States. Like, who would have thought in modern day times that a coup would have been like so easily organized, that you'd actually have a riot that also involved military people, security people, police, people you'd be thinking, surely you don't believe what you're being told. But we have to assume that, yes, there is a large number of people who believe what they're being told. They're online, they're prolific online, they recruit younger and younger and younger people. Young people especially, are online. So they're literally there, ready for the radicalization, ready for the recruitment. And we've also got another shift. So not just the social media, but in the old days, mainstream media never gave white supremacists, white hate groups, KKK, or any of those folks any media attention. Like, stories just weren't written about them. You didn't put one person up on a panel and then have a white supremacist as the counterpoint on it. That never happened. But now they have the same platform everywhere, not just in social media, but now they're actually being interviewed on mainstream media as part of, oh, well, we have to have balance, that kind of fiction. So it's everywhere. It's growing. It's been here in Canada for a long time. And look at what happened in Ottawa, that whole trucker, hostage taking of Ottawa was not too dissimilar, not too far away from what happened in the United States. And round two, it could be even more serious.
This also isn't original analysis, but many people have pointed out that, especially for men, and it's not exclusively men, women believe in conspiracy theories too, but particularly perhaps for disenfranchised white men, it's almost like this idea of living in a superhero movie, right? So this almost very naive idea around what political organizing is, that it's, the one man with the gun who, leads the people. So this idea that's really taken from movies that has no reality to the long, slow grind of organizing. But again, it's seductive to people because they get to imagine themselves as the hero of this kind of narrative, right? That there's an evil group of people and then I show up with my truck and, I'm going to bring down the state, as if that is how activism works, right? But especially in these late capitalist times when we're actually saturated with these images, like all we have is superhero movies these days, like the millionth Avengers movie and then the 10th millionth Spider-Man, so we're also feeding people this kind of social narrative that's very attractive for people who feel like they don't have power, especially if you're a white man that feels that you've lost all kinds of power. This is also a kind of strength narrative that only I can put this together. It's a communal act too. Everybody puts in and contributes to the conspiracy theory. And then we all get into our truck and show up with our guns, or we all storm the Capitol and then we'll take it back. And there's always this kind of easy idea that you can somehow just storm the Bastille today and then you'll take back power from the state. We saw this in the convoy, right? Where people were like, didn't even have a working knowledge of the Canadian political system. We're talking about like amendments to the Constitution, like as if we have that, but also this funneling of political energy into these extremely naive kind of actions. So yeah, I think it also is tied to cultural ideas of what, like we have the same thing on the left, right? We have like celebrity organizing and we believe that if we have the right charismatic leader, they'll lead us all through to socialist paradise. Like, oh, we just need Bernie Sanders and then, everything will be okay. So it's a human thing. It's on all sides of the spectrum. But I think it particularly also allows people this outlet of imagining themselves the hero instead of joining a movement and being part of a long intergenerational years-long struggle.
Well, we'll have to end it there. And that's our episode for today. Thanks to all three of you, Pam, Elle, and Martin. I wish I could say I'll see you next time, but this is going to be my last show for a little while. I'm growing a little human, so I'll be going on leave after today, but I hope I get to join you again very soon.
Congratulations.
Are you growing
Donya.
a human, or are you, incubating a lizard?
yeah,
or
exactly.
Our alien overlords.
The lizard men.
Ask me in 2 months. Don't have too much fun without me, but I'll be back soon, I hope. And thanks to all of you who tuned in to today's program. As always, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Or if you're listening to the podcast version, please remember to like, rate, and share. And if you'd like to help sustain the work of The Breach, please consider becoming a paying subscriber. Go to breachmedia.ca. I'm Donya Ziaee, signing off for The Breach Show.